This is sort of a follow-up question, and it's for Twan Jones. And it gets to the issue of systemic problems that we face that are, at least in part, rooted around issues of race. So how are broader issues of racial disparities within the public schools and in the criminal justice system, the social welfare system, the healthcare system, how are those kinds of disparities related to race relations or race?
And again, I think that he set me up. Oftentimes, I think it has to do with the individuals that are in the position. Unfortunately, and I don't know how to say it any other way. Unfortunately, we have to wait for some people to die off before we see improvement. They've been had their way of thinking all their life, and no policy change from anyone will tell them what they feel or what they want to do is right. And I think oftentimes the person that can put that signature on it, or the person that can say yes from the top down, we will follow this policy, is the one person that is blocking it and standing in the way of it reaching to the bottom. So it starts at the top. A lot of the times we have a lot of people that are currently sitting on the benches as judges that influence the way the school systems and others implement their policies. So I think a lot of times it may not be my generation, because some of the people are still fairly have a long way to go. So I don't know if I'll see it, but hopefully my kids and my grandkids will see someone new in these positions that are open to policies that are being introduced by a more progressive way of us living together.
So you are hopeful.
I'm very
I want to talk with Dr. Payne a little bit about the weight of history. How much of an impact do you feel the 1921 Tulsa race riot had and maybe has on the current state of race relations here in Tulsa?
I think my answer goes back to a couple of answers ago when David was talking about the importance of history. The 1921 Tulsa race riot was horrific. Horrific. The most damage occurred in North Tulsa. Homes were burned, people lost their businesses, people lost their lives, people's ideas about the future were disrupted. It was horrible. There's a part of me, even as I think about that horror and see the plaque in Reconciliation Park that speaks to the 35 square blocks that were burned. Imagine that, 35 square blocks, that's a lot of territory, that were burned. I also find myself thinking about, okay, a lot of the time people seem to think that this happened to North Tulsa. Well, circulation being what it is, Tulsa being, weather being what it was, frankly, if my house burned, your house had stood. So that means everybody was affected by it. Not just the people who lost directly what had been theirs, but also the people who, with some levels of comfort, could say, oh, that happened over there. That didn't really happen to me. And I wish the best for those people who lost their stuff. Because the truth is, it happened to the entire community. And that, I believe, is a part, that piece of history is a part of why that event still looms large over all of us. And we're not real sure what to do about it. After I began working for the John Franklin Center, some things that I had not understood became very clear to me. And one of the first things that cleared itself up for me that I think has to do with today and the 1921 Tulsa race riot was a clear understanding, and I credit Hannibal for part of this, but was a clear understanding that Greenwood was destroyed in 1921, but by 1945 it had been rebuilt. It had been rebuilt. So the people who actually lived through the trauma did something about it and got past it by 1945, 24 years later. It was back to close to where it had been before. Now, 90 years later, if you go down to Greenwood, which had been a bustling place, and was a bustling place in my childhood, it was nothing like what it used to be. It carries no pieces of, it carries very little reminiscence of what it had been. I think our lack of understanding of what happened and what happened after, not just by 1945, but what happened even after that in the 1950s and 1960s and early 1970s into the 1980s, in that area, our failure to realize that a lot of things can stand between where we are now in that community and where we once were. I think that gives that event a lot more power in our community than we would have to allow for it to have. I may not say that well, but I think the more we know, the better off we will be, so that we understand. Woody Guthrie said he had been a racist, and then he learned not to be. The more we know about what actually happened and what has changed the community and how the community has been impacted by a number of changes, I think the better able we will be to tame our own views and to control our views of what's possible now and how that riot has impacted Tulsa. We carry the same kinds of division that we had before the riot. We still carry that. We've already talked about race relations, and we still carry that kind of division with us. We're still a divided community. But in order to do something about it, I think we have to probably get pretty close to the root of why we're divided now, along with what divided us originally, because it's a little bit different.
Thank you. Another question that relates to our history in this community for David Blatt. David, step back in time with me about 40-odd years to 1974. There was a paper published in the American Journal of Sociology that looked at segregation in public elementary schools in 60 cities in the 1967-68 school year. Most schools were still strongly segregated more than a decade after the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. Tulsa, one of those 60 cities, had the most highly segregated schools in the nation. What does this history say about Tulsa, and how much progress have we made since 1974?
I was pretty surprised to see that of all the cities in the nation, that Tulsa, in fact, Tulsa was tied with Oklahoma City as having the most segregated school systems in the late 1960s on the eve of federal efforts to integrate the schools. Because we were not the Deep South, and yet through patterns of laws and practices and customs, we had an exceptionally segregated school system. There has been a lot of change since then, and I suspect that some people here in this room were involved in the efforts in the 1970s to create magnet schools, to create strong programs from the elementary level, middle school, high school with Booker T. Washington. Those were difficult periods. There was conflict. There was a lot of progress made. If you look at the updated figures, our school system is certainly less segregated than it was 40 years ago, and Tulsa is no longer the most segregated city in the nation. We're sort of in the middle. And yet, you still find that there is a concentration of poverty in schools with large concentrations of African American students. Without going into all the numbers, if you look at schools where there are more than 50% African Americans, the participation for free and reduced school lunch, which is a pretty good measure of poverty and low income, is about 90%. If you look at schools that are predominantly white, and there are schools in Tulsa, but especially in the suburbs, with less than 5 or 10% minority students, then the poverty rate is much lower. So you still see schools in predominantly minority areas with high concentrations of poverty, very high concentrations of mobility and absenteeism, and you'll see that in North Tulsa, but also in areas like at McClure, at 61st and Peoria, where the mobility rate, student turnover can be 33% on average over the course of the year. And that creates huge problems in schools where you have such a rapid change in student population. It's extremely hard to make progress teaching any of the kids, even the ones who are staying, when kids are moving in and out. So without question, there's been progress. We don't have the firm division between white schools and black schools that we had before. And really across Tulsa, you see integrated schools, but there are certain schools that still, are more affluent, have better resources, others that, remain a continuing struggle, and it's always been closely tied to race.
Thank you. Twan, let's look at integration beyond the confines of the school system. So, what are your impressions of the level of integration here in Tulsa? And how do you think public policy choices may have affected that level of integration?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
I think, like I mentioned before, I think public policy has forced many people to deal with integration maybe before they were ready to, which I can see evidence because of that force. It has heightened us against them mentality, and it often has set a platform for people to have their biases embraced by like-minded people. And as a result, I think we continue to see throughout our city places and neighborhoods and stores that many people in certain groups feel comfortable in going into and other groups don't feel comfortable in going to. Although it's in place, I think on the outside it looks great that we're trying to move forward. But Tulsa, and I think a lot of it has to do with our denouncing the 1921 race riot as big as it, as big of an impact it has on us. I think it has allowed us to say at least we're on the outside, we're doing something about it. But if you have that heart-to-heart conversation with people, we really demonstrate how we feel about staying with our own kind. It's unfortunate, but it's very true in our community in Tulsa County.
I think we can't deny that Tulsa is a segregated city. And my experience is a little different because I grew up in Canada and have been in upstate New York, and so I hadn't in a fairly small area in upstate New York. So this was really my first American city, but it was pretty shocking to move here and see the various ways in which race plays out. Starting with the realtor who said, well, you're not going to want to live in North Tulsa. Didn't say black, but said you're not going to live in North Tulsa. We were steered towards certain areas, and I think it plays out really across our lives where we are in largely two solitudes. And, you know, Jocelyn mentioned the crowd today. This is no disrespect to those of you who came or to OCCJ. But what sort of constantly surprises me is that it is tied to class and income. And I think the higher you move up the income level, the more segregated it is. If you want to find integrated places in Tulsa, go to a public swimming pool, go to a McDonald's, go to Brahms, but when you go to an upscale restaurant or a country club, or you go to meetings of the executive directors of social service agencies, it is primarily or often exclusively white, with often one or two African American. Jocelyn, I'm sure that's your experience on a regular basis. Hannibal, I'm sure it's yours, and it is mine. And it's easy, I think, as white people, just to sort of miss the fact that there's an absence of people of color, African American, but Hispanic and Asian and Indian as well. So I think that it's just a reality that is just pervasive in this city, and I think, you know, part of addressing it is just to be aware of the fact and be conscious and purposeful. But I think the most important thing is to sort of recognize that we're not going to have connections without really purposeful attempts to bring people together. It's not just going to happen, and in particular, the blacks are not simply going to feel comfortable and come to places, even downtown, the Guthrie Greens or you know, other spaces that are certainly not, there are no keep out signs, but without real active efforts to bring people in, it just doesn't happen on its own in the city.
And I want to thank David for saying, leading the segue, because he pointed out some things that we see and I see that has already been documented about our city, that people, I think a lot of people want to deny and think that don't exist. There is documentation that here in Tulsa County, we don't have to look at some of the urban cities like Detroit, or we don't have to look at Los Angeles. We can look right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and see that disparities exist between ethnic groups. And oftentimes it is the African American population that is disenfranchised. And because of that, like David was saying, that many don't feel comfortable in going to some of these places where it is predominantly white or Caucasian. And because it's not a myth, we understand that driving while black exists in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We understand that it may be a few police officers, less than 1% of the population of police officers that may be rogue cops. When you talk about a police force of over 800 cops, that 1% is a large number. And so they can do damage oftentimes before it is picked up. And so often these disparities exist, disenfranchisement exists, but we want to turn a blind eye and say, well, it's not happening in our city. But it is happening in our city. There is not a reason to have to do more research on the research, on the research, on the research, on the research that has already been done. Even to the point that at the national level, Congress back in 1988 understood and made a report called The Delicate Balance that documented many of the disparities that exist in each community, not just in Tulsa, but nationwide. So the facts are there, and it's just if we want to take those facts and say, hey, we have an opportunity to look at it and come and talk about how do we improve, how does that look when we say those things that are very uncomfortable to be said about how we're treating each other in our society.